Okay, it's the 23rd of September. This is lecture number 6 in Anthropology and the human condition. Good morning. Look, there are people here really. Say hello. Okay. Just check that this working. Yeah. Today we're going to be talking about colonialism, colonial encounters, colonization, and of course, relevant in Vietnam. But also, hello, yoo-hoo. Colonialism, you think it happened in Vietnam, right? But colonialism also happened in France. Even though colonialism happened to Vietnam, it affected France hugely as well. Now, the same with India and England. You can't think about, it's disruptive, please don't. You can't think about, I think it's useful not to just think about colonialism in the colonized countries, but colonialism had important effects and consequences and psychology and pathology in the colonizer countries as well. And it's ongoing today. So in another course, for example, I talk about popular culture in England, and it's mostly about South Asian settlers in England. And they are only there because we, the English people, that's not me, but English people, were there. They say, we are here because you were there. Right? We are here in England because you were there in India. So even though when that's true now, it was also true in the colonial times, the proper colonial times, when England was in India, England was affected by being in India. There's a thinker, writer, famous author called Salman Rushdie, who famously said, the weird thing about the English is that they don't know their own history because it happened overseas. But if they were paying attention, they would see that their colonial history also happened in London, in England, in Liverpool, in Bristol, right? I use those two cities as examples because Liverpool and Bristol were built on the slave trade. Without the slave trade, the port of Liverpool, the port of Bristol would not be what it was. Now, the same can be said about France and Vietnam or Indochina and New Caledonia and Algeria and the other French colonies. And that way of thinking about colonialism is a different way of thinking to how anthropologists first engaged with this topic long back in the 50s and 60s. And yet, we should think about the way in which they talked about colonialism as an encounter between different peoples. An encounter is a powerful word that we should think about, and how it was about domination, but also about resistance. And John Gledhill's work, the article, well, I say a course because John Gledhill's book is the text of his course on anthropology in Manchester that he took over from my course. I was teaching that course. When I left Manchester, he took over the course and course materials, but he made it so much better. I'm not saying, it was my course. His book is an update on what we were doing in Manchester. And his insight or his main point, or his distillation is what he learned from looking at anthropologists working on colonialism, is that you can't just look at domination. You also look at the history of resistance. And he learns that from reading the texts that I was pushing from subaltern studies. And this is a term you won't have heard much, but you probably want to hear a bit. Subaltern studies and the critiques of Gayatri Spivak. Gayatri Spivak. But let's go back a little bit. So we've talked about ethnography, and we've talked about anthropologists doing ethnography, going to have a look for themselves, and having adventures in the Amazon and so on. After these generations, by the 60s, anthropology started really to think about what it was doing. Like Levi-Strauss last week, we talked about him really thinking about and having some philosophical concerns about whether he could understand the Bororo and the Nambikwara. Well, anthropology started really to think about what it was doing and to think about whether or not this project of going to visit some people for a year, learn a little bit about their language, and then write a whole book about them, well, that was obviously a bit crazy. You can't understand a whole culture in just 1 year. Actually, it's a bit weird. I think when you arrive somewhere new, the first couple of months, you see a lot of things that you think are interesting and you might want to write down. But after a couple of months, you start to realize that actually you didn't understand very much at all. And then you spend the next year or 2 years realizing that your first impressions were they were just impressions. Sometimes they can be important, sure, and insights. You can do good travelogue in short time, but to really get to understand a culture takes more than 1 year. And it takes access to people. So the first thing that so-called reflexive anthropology, anthropologists thinking about what they do, the first thing that was a topic was the idea of what is the relationship between the anthropologist and someone we call an informant who tells them about the culture. An informant. Now that's a bit of a weird word because informant comes from, well, where does it come from? It comes from military and maybe police language. If you read detective novels, novels about the police interrogating criminals, you will know that the police often have informants to tell them about crimes. Or if you are working in the military on espionage, spying for your side against the enemy, you need some people in the enemy to give you secret information. That's an informant. So when anthropologists started to think about the person who worked with them to give information about the culture, they called them their informants, innocently at first. The informant is the person who tells the anthropologist the secrets of the culture. A kind of broker. Which is another interesting word with the history. Broker, it's someone who mediates between the person with capital who wants to invest and the investment opportunity. A broker is the person who helps you make an investment. Okay? These words, informant, broker, they are words anthropologists adopted to try and understand what they are doing. So this so-called reflexive turn, the movement within anthropology to think about what anthropology is doing, that begins with Levi-Strauss, well, actually even begins a little bit with Evans Pritchard, because he wrote one essay called The Methodological Significance of the Lying Informant. He was quite arrogant. Evans Pritchard suspected that the people he was interviewing were not telling the truth. Of course not. Why would they tell the truth to this Englishman that came and expected them to carry his stuff? Why would anyone tell him the truth? Just make up some story. And the controversy around Margaret Mead in Samoa. She wrote a book about young women, teenage girls having sex. And afterwards it came out that probably those girls were just bragging. They weren't really having so much sex. They just told the anthropologist something controversial. So anyway, Evans Pritchard has studied this, but reflexive turn meant that anthropology started to work on what it is they do. And then Clifford Geertz and his students especially started to talk about, well, the other thing that anthropologists do is they write books, ethnography, right? We looked at this word before. Can someone tell me the meaning of the two parts of the word? Ethno and graphy? Yeah? Ethnic and graphic. Why ethnic? We can understand as cultural character, and graphic to do with graphene, the parts of writing. So ethnography as ethnographic had been used as a word to describe what they were doing, but they hadn't really thought exactly what that was. And Clifford Geertz started to talk about the anthropologist as a writer. Not an anthropologist as a researcher investigating, but as a researcher investigating, but then writing. And what was important was that construction of the text. So you remember Malinowski, for example, lived in the Trobrandas for 4 years, but we can talk about those 4 years, his fieldwork, but then the next 4 years, him and his wife, very importantly, spent that time writing the book, turning the messy experience into a wonderful book, which is a little bit fiction, but it reads really well, tells a story about this Argonauts and has a theoretical contribution. So Geertz was able to say that this contribution or this effort by anthropologists is a writing practice. And a writing practice inside an institution. Others like Paul Rabinow after Clifford Geertz. I like to call him Paul Rainbow, but Paul Rabinow. And a number of others, James Ferguson. I want to call him Rainbow. Kevin Dwyer, Ted Locke, Barbara and I want to say Ted Locke, but I forget. A number of anthropologists started to talk about what it is, or ask questions about what it is to write books about people and just put them in the library. Of course, that's not just what they did, but it's kind of what they did. You write books and you put them in the library and you get a professorship. Hooray! But other people, of course, read those books and do things with those books and learn and are trained for various jobs, learn criticism, or as we'll see in later weeks, their books that they wrote and put in the library, for example, about Vietnam, were used by the military, the CIA, to help with the war effort. Anyway, there was this questioning of what anthropology does. Now, my question for you to think about, and this will be important for what we do in further weeks and for your assessment, midterm and finals, I want to ask you, why would anthropology as a discipline turn to reflexivity? What would cause somebody is going along, they've got a very successful research practice, going on adventures on islands, coming back and writing books. And that was going on for, 50 years, well, 30 years successfully, from from 1910 to 1950, 40 years, very successfully. Why did they suddenly start to have this reflexive turn? What is the cause? And I really want that question to be in your mind. Why? What happened to make anthropologists reflect critically on what they do? Let's just say reflect. What happened in the 50s and 60s to make anthropology really seriously start to think about what they do? Okay. Now, what Gledhill tells us, if you've read his article, you'll know, and not enough people have read his article. I received 15 homeworks, 36 are not done. If you want to pass this course, 30% of your assessment is the homeworks. You can do them, please, without pleasure. Anyway, but if you've read Gledhill, you'll know that what he starts off saying is rehearsing the context story. Rehearsing the old context story can be another way of denying Europe's others a role in history. What does he mean? First of all, what is the context story? The context story was a story that Europeans told themselves about their great adventures in the world. Captain Cook or Columbus went in a tiny little boat from England all around the oceans, and then they went to America. Columbus thought it was India, or Australia, and they met other people. And then anthropologists kind of told that heroic story as well. We went and we met Australian Aboriginals or Papua New Guinea people or whatever. The history of colonialism was often this context story. When the Portuguese first came around the edge of Africa into the Indian Ocean and came to Asia, whee, hooray, weren't Europeans wonderful? Asian people were already here, had already been doing that for hundreds of years. You can look up Chengde and see a Chinese eunuch had sailed from China to Africa 3, 4, 5, maybe even 7 times in the 1400s, long before all of this European first time to come to the Indian Ocean, right? But English European historians don't want to know about that. The Chinese built ships? No, they just built junk. They call them junks. They didn't understand that history. But this was the idea. You have a little rainy island called England. You have France, Portugal, and Spain. And then you go past the Mediterranean and past Africa, past Madagascar to India and Malaysia, Vietnam, and Japan. And you visit these places. Australia is somehow here. That's a really bad Australia, but anyway. The idea was ships that first hugged the coast and went into the Mediterranean and so on, eventually struck out into the ocean, into the Indian Ocean, and discovered the spices, herbs and spices, especially hot spices. For Europeans, it was pepper and nutmeg, cardamom. I should find out the Tingviet names for these things. Okay, but that's the context story. Of course, the context story is told in critical ways. Let's not forget that some people tell that story as it's truly represented as conquest, as a violent encounter. So Vasco da Gama, you should know this name anyway. Vasco da Gama. Ever heard this name? Anyone? Vasco da Gama? He was a Portuguese captain who sailed the first ship across the Indian Ocean to India. Really, again. But the history of conquest, it only in the last 40 years or so was shown in the history that he had been a very violent captain. When he met and disliked these people he contacted, informants and so on, if they did something he disagreed with, he cut off their ears and nose. When he saw a ship going from India to Mecca, so full of pilgrims, full of Muslims going to Mecca to pray, he sunk that ship. Maybe there was 1,000 people on that ship. Not hostile people, not the enemy in any way, religious figures. So the context story is one of killing, one of violence. So the context story, colonialism arrived in Africa, Asia, Americas, and people say then everything changed because this more powerful leaves. More powerful ships and more powerful armies came to Asia. And Asia was somehow, in the old story, context story, underdeveloped or something. Well, sorry, still talk about that in that way. And Europeans came, and because they had better technology and etc., because they were better people, they will say, everything changed. But that's not the case. When Europeans arrived in India, India was a very developed economic power. 1/4 of the world's production was happening in India. 1/4 of the whole world's production in its trade, its commodity system, jewelry, weaving, cotton, farming, agriculture. 1/4 of world production was in that area of India called Bengal, Greater Bengal. And that's why Europeans came. They came and they saw there's a spice trade, and they saw the opportunity to take those riches, those wealth, and bring them back to Europe. A much longer story needs to be told as an alternative, which is the origins of the Industrial Revolution are based in that extraction of wealth. Without the capital that was claimed through colonialism, the Industrial Revolution of Europe could not be kick-started. They had to invest in production. Where did they get the capital to do that? By plundering Africa for slaves, India for wealth through trade with cotton, jewelry, and opium. Tukfin. So the alternative story, why does it have no traction? Why does it not catch hold? Because it's very embarrassing for Europe. They were, oh yes, they had good armies because they've been fighting each other for a long time. Then they came to Asia and they took, you know that part of the story at least. So the arrival stories that we tell. First of all, Gayatri Spivak has said, the arrival of Europeans in those countries on their ships was not the first act. If you arrive somewhere and you end up taking their wealth, logically, they must already have had wealth, they must have already had production, they must have already had a very developed society. You cannot make yourself rich from a society that doesn't have anything going on. You can only make yourself rich if you steal from someone who's rich. So Asia had already to be rich before Europeans came. And the normal story about colonialism is that Europeans came and they had better technology and they developed Asia. That's not true. Europeans came and they extracted the wealth from Asia. So that wealth, the economic system that existed, Mughal India, the feudal system in East Asia and Southeast Asia was already rich. And the Europeans came and they had better ships and better armies so they could take it. That's their only advantage. But so, when she says the first act was not contact, that's what we mean. The first act in colonialism was not the arrival of the colonists. It was the fact that Asia was very developed. And then for 300, 400 years, Europeans took away that wealth. Huge, huge amounts. They bled India dry. The Dutch bled Indonesia. The French, they came a bit later, but they did the same to Indochina. Get the locals addicted to opium and occupy their production and accumulate wealth and take it back. That's the contact story. But it didn't just start there. The origin, the beginning part of the story is what is being missed. That they entered a place that was already developed. Now, Gledhill then says this is a postmodern way of speaking. That Gayatri Spivak is a representative of postmodern thinking because she is influenced by Jacques Derrida. She had translated Derrida's work. Okay, in another course I talk about that a lot. But postmodernism means what? I'm not even going to get into the debates about what postmodernism means. Obviously, modernism is a context story that could belong to modernism. Postmodernism is a challenge to meaning. So people will say that postmodern anthropology is that anthropology that starts to doubt whether or not its previous work had been true. doubting whether or not there's even truth, a postmodern move. Postmodernism overlaps with post-colonialism, and so on. Clerio finds that post-colonialism is a very difficult term as well. I'm not sure that he understands really the way in which the term post-colonialism was used. Post-colonial the thing is, Gayatri Spivak is not a post-colonial thinker. She is a critic of post-colonialism. And the way in which they use post-colonialism is not to say there was colonialism and now after colonialism there's post-colonialism. Too many people take it like that. So when you hear the term post-colonialism, it doesn't mean that. It means that there was colonialism and then there was anti-colonialism. They were bound together. The modernist version is the conflict. But then those countries that were colonized got independence. Who got independence when? We can go through that list again. Right? 1945, Vietnam. 1947, India and Pakistan. 1949, China. 1953, Algeria. No, sorry, 1952, Cuba, etc., etc. Algeria, Angola, so many countries in the 50s, and then in the 60s, Ghana and Tanzania, and so on with Julius Nyerere. So many countries got independence. Were they then, once they got independence, their colonial struggle, their anti-colonial movement was successful? Does that mean they were post-colonial? That's not how thinkers like Gayatri Spivak or Samia Amin meant post-colonial. They meant post-colonial was a kind of ongoing colonialism done by the people that had led the elites who led the colonial struggle. Okay, I don't think this applies to Vietnam, but in India, the anti-colonial effort by Gandhi and Nehru and so on, which was a radical movement, by the 1970s had reintroduced the kind of economy that belonged to the colonial times. Another word for it might be neo-colonialism. But neo-colonialism meant French, English, whatever companies still doing business in India. It wasn't colonial anymore because they had freedom and independence, but it was still colonialism, but neo-colonialism. But the Indian government under Indira Gandhi, the Indonesian government under Suharto, they had become like the old colonizers. Some might say Deng Xiaoping in China reinstated capitalist thinking. We won't get into any further discussion, but this is what was meant by post-colonialism. It was used in a kind of tragic, critical, and ironic sense. The hope there was anti-colonialism in India, in Indonesia, turned into disappointment because the elites took control. New equality, equal society was not achieved. The hierarchy of those societies was reinforced. So post-colonialism was that. Yes, it happened after colonialism, but it was kind of more of a continuity with colonialism. Now, Gladhill says Spivak is difficult. Sure, yeah, she's difficult because her concepts are really difficult because she's trying to write a new kind of history. one more honest. So she'll talk about the perspective of the subaltern. I'd written it all up and crossed it out, subaltern. And then there was a group called Subaltern Studies. And if you are interested in history, I recommend you read the works of people in Subaltern Studies, especially Ranajit Guha, who's kind of the founder. And his book is called Elementary Aspects of Peasant Insurgency, which is fantastic because elementary aspects of peasant insurgency is his topic, but elementary aspects of, that kind of is a tribute to Claude Lévi-Strauss, because his book on kinship had been Elementary Aspects of Kinship. So he copied the title. But what is Subaltern Studies? What is Subaltern Studies? What are they interested in? Exactly related to this post-colonial critique. They wanted to say the history that has been written about the peoples of India is written from the perspective of the British. And in fact, for most of the time, the history was written by the British. And if we study the British records, we can tell the British story. But if you are very good at studying records, you can read that record against the British story. Read in the gaps the story of who the British were reacting to. When the British write their history, we sent 100 troops to quell the rioting in Bagoda or someone like that. The good historian says, oh, the British sent troops to that town. That means something was happening in that town. The British just say they sent troops to quell the rebellion. But how did the rebellion begin? Who were the rebels? What was their history? Subaltern Studies tries to tell the history of those who are not in the record book, but who obviously are kind of talked about by the record book. What would be a way to think about this for Vietnam? All right, yeah, classic. Have you seen the 10-part documentary on the Vietnam War by Burns and I can't remember who? Yeah. So that story is largely the story of what happened to Americans in the American War, with a little bit about Vietnamese soldiers and so on, and some interviews with surviving. But they have to go and get these old men and get them to tell the story. And of course, they can't tell everything about what happened. Because the Americans, they were documenting everything, except when they killed whole villages, right? They tried to keep that secret. But they were documenting everything. So we have a massive amount of documentary evidence from the American side. They had film cameras and they had journalists, and it tells the story in a biased way. But on the other side, the revolutionaries, the Viet Minh and so on, they didn't have, well, they had some journalists, of course, but they didn't have the same amount of people writing down what happened. Partly because you didn't want to tell the enemy what you're doing. That's sensible. But now, to tell the story of the war, don't make a documentary like Burns does, which retells the American story. You have to really go into the archives and find the gaps where there's another story about what was done to defeat. So the subaltern refers to that story which is suppressed, subordinate, secondary, but is alternative, subaltern, right? That's bad etymology. It's not really like that, but You could think about it like that. There's the true historical record, the history of battles and deployments of troops. And then there's the history of resistance to that record. And to find that history is the work of subaltern studies. So the problem is that Gledhill's understanding of Spivak is really that she's in a contradictory position, but I don't think he can grasp what she's saying. She's saying that most institutional academics have been in the practice of writing about the other. The other, the story of the other, will always be written about by someone from the institution. The other, who's the tribe, the informant, the rebels, you know, they cannot write their own history because they're not in the institution. Somebody is writing about them. Even when they then move into the institution, they have to become more like the professors, the anthropologists, the historians that belong in the institution. So the subaltern experience will always be translated into the kind of talk about others that is common inside the institutions. I didn't translate this one because I think it's really too hard. Can I get you to read this quote from Spivak? Yes, you. Can you read the first one? Really loud.
Replications of the unilateral oral teleological colonial.
Thank you. All right, that was a bit mean, I think. It's a difficult phrase. What work do we need to do to avoid the endless replication? So the endless replication, repeating and repeating and repeating the same contact story. The unilateral Euro-teleological colonial context story. What is that? Unilateral means one-sided. Unilateral means the perspective of Europe, America. Euro-teleological means Europe is always the moving forward to progress in history. Even its colonial contact, where it exploits and steals from Asia and Africa, is part of its development story. What do we need to do to avoid endless replication of this story that's one-sided, all about Europe developing, even in the colonial contact? We need to do subaltern studies to find the stories of that wealthy, rich Asia, of the resistance, of the rebellion, the stories that were not put into the history. And then there's a problem, because why should the university, why should the library, why should the anthropologists and historians writing books have any say over that resistance? Won't they then translate it into, again, this Euro-teleological story? So with a number of concepts, like subaltern, learning from the theorist, the Italian communist Antonio Gramsci, whose term subaltern is. Gramsci suggested that. He talked about a war of position and a war of, well, he talked about hegemony. Which side in any conflict has hegemony, meaning is able to define what really happens, to tell the history, to tell the story. Whose story wins? And you can see this in Vietnam as well. If you watch Hollywood cinema about Vietnam, and about the American-Vietnam War, if you watch Rambo films and all of that, you would think that the Americans had won. They are so heroic and their experience in Vietnam was this, this, and this. You think that they had somehow not been defeated and made to run away with their tail between their legs. Right? That's what hegemony is. Hegemony is the process of rewriting history to make it seem like what happened didn't happen. If you go to the War Remnants Museum, I think we should as a class excursion, and you read in the book where the comments are from all the people who visit the War Remnants Museum, you will read a debate about whether or not America could have won the war or what happened. I mean, there's some people are saying this should never happen again, it was terrible, terrible. But some people are saying bizarre things, right? They believe very strange things about what actually happened. And they wrote it down in this book. They say that that War Remnants Museum is biased and so on. I don't think it is. I don't think it's even shocking enough. War is horrible. Anyway, that's the concept of hegemony. Spivak also uses the work of Derrida. In Derrida, the phenomenology of deconstruction, especially looking at language, how words can be used to impose structure, a perspective. Deconstruction is the deconstruction of those truths that seem true because of that perspective. A double bind, aesthetic education, and constant work on criticism to try to tell that alternative story. And to constantly realize, even in trying to tell the alternative story, you will be tripped up because the requirement to put knowledge into concepts in books in the traditional way is really quite persistent, hard to escape. So Spivak says constant vigilance, and in fact, this is the difficult thing that she teaches. We as teachers, and I think as students, as researchers, because I want to say every student is a researcher. That's how you have to imagine yourself as an investigator, as someone looking for knowledge, doing research. Right? You know it's not there, but you know it exists. You know there's something that isn't there, you have to find it out. Not just look up on Google. We need to slowly work patiently to rearrange the desire to do well in the institution to be instead something critical. Please. So it's about knowledge. Knowledge of the history of colonialism. So what was the impact of colonialism as political power, as a knowledge system, and the relation between the two? The British are famous for creating a class of in-between people. There's a famous so-called minute by Macaulay on education where he says, we must create a class of people that sit between the British rulers and the Indian people. They will be Indian, but they will be British in their thinking. They will learn the habits and ways and culture of the British, but they will be, you know, they're not quite. They're not white. They'll be brown Englishmen. And they are the ones who become the brokers. A class of people that do the administration of colonialism on behalf of the British rule, or French rule, or Dutch rule. And they have a status above the local people, the colonized. The creation of an elite within the colonial context, within the colonial culture, We call it, another word for it within Marxism, from the Marxist tradition. You know what we call them? You need to think about this. What do we call the people of that class in the colonial culture that sit between the rulers and the people and do the bidding of the rulers even though they are from Vietnam or India or whatever? We have a term for this in Marxism. Huh? Division of labor? Yeah, it's related, but there's a special term for it. I wonder if you're taught this. Okay, it's the creation of a special class of people. They work as brokers or informer or in between the colonial rulers and the people, but they are from the people, from the colonized peoples, but they have seen the opportunity of working for the British or working for the French. This class we call comprador, the comprador class. It starts out as they are a local businessman who says, oh yes, Englishman, with all the money you want to invest in this opium, I can help you. But then they become a class. That fixer or organizer or broker eventually becomes a whole class. And you know, into this class there are divisions. So some of this class will be the children of relationships between an English and an Indian. English colonial administrators used to take Indian wives. Well, I don't know whether they married them or sometimes they did. And of course there were children from that, especially working in the railways in India. A lot of the mixed race Indians, Anglo-Indians, ended up working in the railways. As Britain built a railway system, it allowed or encouraged Anglo-Indians to work in the railways, and they had a lock on that industry because it's very important for moving goods, right? So the class that sits between the English and the colonized, the Anglo-Indians were a part of that because they were doing transport work, moving opium or cotton or indigo or rice or what have you. The comprador class. And Macaulay had said these will be trained, and they even had an exam system. A bit like the old administration exam in the Confucian system. You had to do what's called the Indian Civil Service exam. And there was competition among the families of the colonized, to the elite at least, to get into that and win that exam because that meant a job for life. Of course, there were benefits, especially to the Brahmanical caste. They saw benefits or opportunities in working with the British. In Marxism, we will call this opportunist. In fact, I think in Tingviet it's called Donghua. Donghua, yeah? Opportunist. It took me a long time to find the translation for that because it's an old Vietnamese word. And really, I found in a dictionary, it means that person who has two ways of looking, like a two-headed snake. They will say this nice thing to you, but they will then make money from you. Kind of two-headed dragon. That's its old meaning. In fact, Nia, who's a member of our staff, found that for me in a dictionary. Because they're translating Dung Kak Min. Okay, where are we? What was the impact of colonialism as political power and knowledge system? It created a kind of knowledge system. This comprador class had its own examination to get into it. It became the administrator, so they had to be educated in English ways. They had to go to English schools, which were set up inside India. And also there was one set up in London, or outside London, called Haileybury College. And it created a vast apparatus of knowledge about the colonial context. You cannot govern and occupy, you can't occupy and govern another country without a knowledge system, a surveillance system. So it generated a lot of information about, I mean, if we look at the records we have, the French in Indochina were writing down so many things about Vietnam, measuring this and that, measuring the Mekong, mapping it, geographical measurements, crop yields, and thinking about that. They produced a lot of information. Some of them even maybe produced knowledge, which is different. But there was a massive effort alongside raw political power, an effort to know. Because to know someone, you can control them. We call it knowledge power, which comes from Foucault, but knowledge power. Spivak picks it up from Foucault. So the economic exploitation, the military victory, economic exploitation was supported by systems of knowledge, by administrative knowledge. And that's important because anthropology fits into that. The systems of administrative knowledge include ethnography. You remember that when I said Malinowski arrived with the police because he was stuck in Australia during World War I. The Governor Hunt, had said, you can help with native administration. Anthropologists continually help the colonial rule. Sometimes they say they are doing resistance work as well, or they are opposed to it. They want the best for the people. But even then, they are still working to know these others. So they did things like the India survey, anthropological studies, ethnicity and diaspora studies. And that goes on even today, especially diaspora studies and studies of diasporic culture, studies of even ecotourism today, talking about culture, is part of managing the neo-colonial or post-colonial polity. Do you see how knowledge ecotourism could be a knowledge system that helps control someone? How did it go? Well, here is what your culture is about. You, I don't know, Highland people or something. We've done this ethnography, and this is what your culture is really about. And in order to encourage ecotourism, you should perform that culture. Don't get too westernized. Don't wear so many Western clothes. Use your traditional clothes. Keep your traditional dances. Be proud of your ethnicity, because that can serve the economic interest of ecotourism, which is good for the nation. Now imagine that, okay, that's in Vietnam. And Vietnam's tourism industry before COVID was big, but not huge. Not, you know, it's relatively to somewhere like Indonesia or India, the population is smaller, right? What, 90 million compared to 1.3 billion. But in India, all over India, tourism thrives on people performing their culture. And you need anthropologists and you need sociologists to tell them how to perform their culture. Because of course, Disney and television and mobile phones and all of that work against it. All right, I was going to talk about Comprador next, but we'll wait after a break. Have 10 minutes. You can absorb this. 10-minute break now for 10:31 to 10:41. Come too quick. Too soon. What? Okay? That's it for now. 5-minute break, 10-minute break.